Most people think financial ruin arrives with sirens. They imagine it begins with a market crash, a bank failure, a government announcement, or some single terrifying morning. When the headlines finally say what everyone feared, that is rarely how it works. In real life, ruin usually begins much earlier and much more quietly. It begins in ordinary moments. It begins at the car dealership when somebody agrees to finance far more than they should. It begins in the mortgage office when a family stretches to buy the largest house a bank will approve. It begins in the drive-through line, on the delivery app, in the clothing store, in the endless stream of small subscriptions that slip out of a checking account month after month without serious thought. People imagine wealth is lost in spectacular events. Most often, it is lost in habits. I have spent my life studying how capital behaves, how incentives shape behavior, how compounding rewards discipline, and how leverage punishes vanity. The lesson that returns again and again is simple. What destroys people is not merely bad luck. It is the repeated decision to exchange future productive capital for present emotional comfort. And that lesson becomes more important when the larger economic environment becomes less forgiving. In easy periods, people can hide mistakes. Rising markets forgive them. Cheap money forgives them. Low rates forgive them. Asset inflation forgives them. A person can overpay for a house, finance an absurd vehicle, live on restaurant meals, chase appearances, leak money through forgotten recurring charges, and still feel intelligent because the surrounding environment is lifting almost everybody. Then the cycle changes. When the cycle changes, what looked harmless becomes expensive, what looked manageable becomes suffocating, what looked normal becomes lethal. That is the environment I want to talk about. The central idea is not complicated. Over the next phase of the debt cycle, the greatest divide will not be between geniuses and ordinary people. It will be between those who protected investable capital and those who consumed it. That divide decides who becomes forced to sell and who becomes able to buy. It decides who enters a crisis afraid and who enters it prepared. It decides who experiences a deleveraging as personal destruction and who experiences it as the opening of a lifetime. People do not like hearing that because it removes their favorite excuses. They want a villain that lives somewhere else. They want the Federal Reserve, Washington, Wall Street, inflation, recession, oil prices, foreign governments, technology disruption, or some other external force to explain why they cannot get ahead. I understand why that story appeals to them. External enemies are emotionally satisfying. Internal discipline is much less entertaining. But the truth is that economic storms do not create weak balance sheets. They reveal them. Ray Dalio learned something related to that many years ago. In the early 1980s, he made a confident macro prediction, went public with it, and turned out to be badly wrong. The economy did not collapse the way he expected. Instead, conditions improved. He suffered financially and personally. That failure pushed him away from prediction as a form of ego and toward pattern study as a form of survival. He began to care less about sounding certain and more about understanding how debt cycles behavior. And historical patterns repeat. That is a useful lesson for any investor. I do not need to pretend that I know the exact day or month when the next major adjustment arrives. I do not need to claim supernatural timing. I only need to understand the structure of the game well enough to prepare my balance sheet and my behavior before the environment becomes severe. That is where most people fail. They wait for clarity. They want the all-clear signal before they change their lives. They want the newspaper to confirm the danger, the market to confirm the danger, their neighbors to confirm the danger. And then, once everybody agrees, they want to prepare. By then, the preparation window has usually passed. Dalio has argued that we are in the late part of a long debt cycle, somewhere near the point where the accumulated burden becomes harder to hide with optimism alone. He points to a national debt structure so large that total obligations across sectors are counted in the tens of trillions, with government interest expense itself moving above $1 trillion a year. That sort of arithmetic should make any thoughtful person less casual, not more. When a society reaches that stage, people still try to live as if the good times are permanent. That is the costly illusion. If a debt cycle is approaching its late stage, the practical question is not whether the evening news has finally become scary enough. The practical question is whether your daily spending habits are quietly destroying the very capital you will need when fear arrives. That is why I want to talk about 5 categories of spending and behavior that repeatedly place people on the wrong side of a major wealth transfer. None of them look dramatic. That is exactly why they are so dangerous. The first is the automobile habit that people insist on calling necessity, when it is very often vanity wrapped in monthly payments. A car can be a useful tool. It can get you to work, carry your family, and support a business. I have no objection to transportation. My objection is to the financial illiteracy that appears when people buy declining assets with borrowed money and then call the decision practical. A new vehicle often begins losing value the moment the owner takes possession. That part is not mysterious. It is one of the clearest forms of depreciation in everyday life. Yet millions of people willingly place themselves in the exact position every rational investor tries to avoid. They borrow at a substantial interest rate to buy an asset that is very likely to decline in value much faster than the loan balance declines. It is a double punishment. First, the asset falls. Second, the financing cost rises over time. If I offered you an investment that began by dropping materially the instant you bought it and then charged you interest for the privilege of holding it, you would reject it. But wrap that same structure in polished metal, showroom lighting, leather seats, and a little social admiration, and suddenly otherwise sensible people line up to participate. That is not economics. That is emotion. And emotion is expensive. People defend the purchase by telling themselves they deserve it, or that reliability requires buying new, or that the payment fits the budget. I have heard every version of that reasoning. None of it changes the arithmetic. A budget can accommodate a mistake and still leave it a mistake. The real issue is opportunity cost. Every large and unnecessary dollar tied up in vehicle depreciation is a dollar not put to work in a productive asset. It is not just the initial cash that disappears. It is the compounded value of what that cash could have become over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. That is the silent theft. People see the car. They do not see the future capital that never had the chance to multiply. A person may think they purchased transportation. Very often they purchased a slower future. That missing capital matters enormously in a late debt cycle. When liquidity tightens, the person with cash and modest fixed obligations has choices. The person with a large vehicle payment and very little savings has none. In prosperous periods, both individuals may look similar. In a harsher period, they live in different universes. The more sensible approach is painfully unglamorous, which is precisely why it works. Let someone else absorb the steep early depreciation, buy dependable transportation after the dramatic loss of value has already occurred. Focus on utility, maintenance history, and cost of ownership rather than image. Keep the purchase proportionate to your actual needs. Then take the capital you did not burn and place it where compounding can do something useful with it. That sounds boring because it is boring. Boring is often profitable. I never built wealth by trying to look rich in parking lots. I built it by directing capital toward assets that could produce more capital. People laugh at old habits until those habits create freedom. Then they call the result wisdom, as though it appeared by magic. The second category is even more emotionally loaded because society has spent generations teaching people to confuse a house with an automatic investment triumph. A home can be many things. It can be comfort, it can be stability, it can be a place where children grow up and memories collect. I do not dismiss those personal values. But from a cold financial perspective, people often commit a serious error when they treat a primary residence as though it automatically functions like a compounding productive asset. Words matter here. An asset, in the strict economic sense, contributes value to your financial position in a way that strengthens cash generation or appreciates in a way you can realize efficiently. A large, heavily financed primary residence can do the opposite for a very long time. It can absorb mortgage payments, insurance, taxes, maintenance, repairs, utilities, and endless upgrades, all while convincing the owner that they are becoming wealthier, because the nominal estimate on a real estate website moved upward. That psychological trick has wrecked many balance sheets. People hear that real estate goes up over time and assume the statement applies to any purchase. At any price, with any financing structure, under any macro condition, history does not support such laziness. Japan offered a brutal reminder after the late 1980s bubble. American homeowners received one in 2008 and the years that followed. A housing purchase can be sensible. It can also become a 30-year obligation that drains flexibility and leaves the owner exposed exactly when flexibility matters most. The most common mistake is not ownership itself, it is over-ownership. Banks tell people what they can qualify for. People then confuse qualification with prudence. The bank may tell a household that it can handle a certain mortgage level. What the bank means is that the household can theoretically service that debt under current assumptions. That is not the same thing as saying the decision is wise, resilient, or conducive to long-term wealth creation. A person who buys the maximum house a lender will permit is often turning future optionality into present square footage. They do not feel the damage immediately because the damage appears in the form of what they can no longer do. They cannot invest as much, they cannot endure job uncertainty as easily, they cannot relocate freely, they cannot handle repairs comfortably. They cannot buy assets aggressively when markets fall because the house has already absorbed the margin of safety that should have been in the family balance sheet. Then rates stay high or values soften or local conditions weaken, and what seemed like a personal milestone begins to behave like a trap. I have lived in the same house for an extraordinarily long time for a reason. I always understood that status housing is one of the most effective ways to impair a perfectly good compounding machine. Every unnecessary dollar poured into oversized personal consumption is a dollar pulled out of the productive system that actually creates independence. That is the real issue. Opportunity cost is not a theory. It is a lifelong tax on vanity. When a late-stage debt cycle moves toward deleveraging, overextended housing becomes especially dangerous. The household with modest housing costs can remain calm, save aggressively, and perhaps become a buyer when prices weaken. The household that stretched for the largest possible mortgage becomes vulnerable to the exact opposite outcome. Instead of deploying capital during distress, they spend the distress trying to defend their lifestyle. That is not how wealth is built across cycles. It is how wealth is lost across cycles. The wiser path is usually simpler and less admired. Buy less house than the bank says you can afford. Leave room for savings, for error, for maintenance, for investment, for life. Let your residence serve your family rather than dominate your balance sheet. Then place the surplus into businesses, funds, or productive assets that are capable of compounding rather than consuming. The third category is where many people roll their eyes because the amounts appear small. They think the problem cannot be serious because each individual decision feels trivial. That is exactly how trivial decisions become permanent damage. I am talking about routine food spending, convenience spending, daily consumption that disappears almost as fast as it arrives. Restaurant meals, delivery fees, coffee habits, impulse lunches, constant takeout, thoughtless convenience spending. None of it sounds fatal. In one isolated instance, none of it is. Compounding does not care whether the seed was planted by a dramatic decision or a forgettable one. A small repeated leak can sink a large ship if it is never repaired. People say they do not have money to invest, and then they spend meaningful sums every week on food they barely remember a day later. They call it normal life. In practice, many of them are consuming the capital that could have funded their retirement, their emergency reserve, or their future opportunity fund. I am not making a moral argument about whether somebody should ever enjoy a meal out. That misses the point. The point is whether a person is spending unconsciously in a way that systematically converts investable surplus into fleeting convenience. Once that behavior becomes habitual, the numbers become staggering over long stretches of time. The tragedy is that this spending often accelerates with stress. A person feels busy, tired, under pressure, emotionally depleted. They respond by outsourcing more routine decisions, paying more for convenience, and telling themselves they will get serious later. Later rarely comes. The habit becomes identity. Before long, the household that claims investing is impossible is quietly bleeding thousands a year into consumption that leaves no lasting economic residue. This matters in every environment. It matters even more when the economy becomes less forgiving. A household that has trained itself to spend automatically on convenience finds it very hard to reverse course when conditions deteriorate. The spending is not just transactional anymore. It has become emotional support that makes the eventual adjustment more painful and therefore less likely to happen in time. There is an old and unglamorous remedy: plan meals. Cook at home most of the time, prepare in advance, reduce impulse decisions. Treat routine food spending like part of an investment system, not like an accidental leftover category. The goal is not misery. The goal is discipline. If you can save meaningful sums every month simply by becoming intentional about an area where money disappears rapidly, you have found a source of investable capital hidden in plain sight. And that is one of the central truths of wealth building. Many people do not need a mysterious opportunity. They need to stop leaking the opportunity they already have. The fourth category goes deeper because it is less about any single object and more about the psychology of self-worth being outsourced to consumption. Status spending is one of the most efficient wealth destroyers ever invented because it disguises insecurity as self-expression. It tells people that appearance is progress. It tells them that upgrading their outward symbols is equivalent to upgrading their underlying financial position. It tells them that being seen as successful is close enough to becoming successful. Nothing could be more destructive. The culture surrounding modern consumption is designed to keep people psychologically restless. There is always a newer phone, a fresher style, a more fashionable item, a more premium version, a more exclusive signal, a more expensive way to tell strangers that you exist. The system does not make money when you are content. It makes money when you are slightly ashamed of what you already own. That shame is monetized with extraordinary efficiency. A person who measures themselves against the visible consumption of others is entering a race that has no finish line. There will always be somebody with a larger home, a newer vehicle, better clothes, a rarer watch, a more impressive vacation, a more curated life. If your financial behavior is built on keeping up with people you may not even respect, then your balance sheet has already surrendered to a foolish master. What matters in life and in investing is not the ability to impress passing observers. It is the ability to compound resources, maintain independence, and make decisions from strength rather than desperation. I have never found that strangers' approval compounds at attractive rates. A good business can do that. A broad index purchase sensibly over time can do that. A collection of productive assets held with patience can do that. Luxury signaling usually cannot. The most intelligent, wealthy people I have known did not spend much time trying to look wealthy. They cared whether something was useful, durable, and sensibly priced. They understood that quality can be a wise purchase, but constant upgrading for the sake of image is an act of surrender. It hands control of your financial behavior to external perception. The numbers become absurd when people examine them honestly. Clothing that is constantly cycled for image. Electronics replace far ahead of necessity. Gadgets purchased because novelty feels like progress, premium everything. Convenience versions of already adequate tools. The total can become enormous without ever producing a durable improvement in financial life. And the real cost, again, is not merely the cash outflow. It is the capital not invested. It is the flexibility not preserved. It is the future buying power that never had the chance to exist because it was traded for social signaling that fades almost immediately. There is also a psychological cost. Status spending keeps a person externally focused. It turns attention outward. It creates a constant awareness of where one stands in the social theater of possessions. That state of mind is toxic for serious investing. Good investing usually requires independent judgment, emotional patience, and the ability to let the crowd think what it wants while you follow arithmetic. A person addicted to impression management has a harder time developing those qualities. The fifth category is the quietest because it hides in automation, subscriptions, recurring charges, unused services, forgotten monthly drains. They do not arrive with drama. They do not demand a major decision every day. They simply remain, and because they remain, they often escape scrutiny far longer than larger expenses would. This is one of the great advantages companies have learned to exploit. A person may fight over a large one-time purchase. The same person will ignore a series of modest automatic withdrawals for years if they are spread across enough categories and padded by convenience. That pattern is not just a budgeting issue, it reflects a broader mindset of passive consumption. It assumes that because the amount does not feel painful in a single month, it is not economically meaningful. That assumption is false. A handful of recurring charges can become dozens. Streaming services, digital tools, fitness memberships, software subscriptions, meal plans, premium features, cloud storage, entertainment bundles, forgotten applications, duplicated services that no one in the household fully uses. Each one feels defensible when viewed alone. Together, they can represent a meaningful annual claim on capital. And since these charges are automatic, they are especially dangerous in a culture where people increasingly organize life around convenience rather than awareness. Financial strength begins with awareness. You cannot manage what you do not examine. One of the simplest disciplines a household can adopt is a scheduled review of recurring charges, not a vague intention to clean things up eventually. A real calendar-based system. Sit down quarterly, pull the statements, identify every recurring outflow, ask whether the service has been used, whether it genuinely provides value, and whether you would actively sign up for it again today if it were not already running in the background. That last question is powerful because it strips away inertia. Inertia is a hidden tax. Companies count on it. They count on people being too distracted, too tired, or too indifferent to interrupt a small stream of money leaving the account over years. That indifference can cost a fortune. What interests me most is not the list itself, but the unifying principle behind all 5 categories. In each case, the person is consuming future optionality with the car. They consume it through depreciation and debt. With the oversized house, they consume it through leverage and fixed obligation. With routine convenience food spending, they consume it through repetition. With status spending, they consume it through social insecurity. With subscriptions, they consume it through inattention. Different costumes, same villain. This becomes extraordinarily important when a society approaches the later stage of a debt cycle. If the broad system is heavily indebted and the government is devoting immense sums to interest expense, then the environment ahead is unlikely to be gentle indefinitely. There are only so many ways debt burdens resolve: defaults, restructuring, inflation, financial repression, or some combination of those forces tend to appear in history. Again and again, the names change, the mechanics vary. The pressure does not disappear because people prefer optimism. Dalio likes to study empires and debt arcs over centuries, not months. Whether you look at the Dutch, the British, Latin America in the 1980s, Japan after the bubble, or the United States during the global financial crisis, the broad lesson is the same. When debt expectations and asset prices become badly misaligned, the adjustment eventually arrives. The surprise is not that it happens. The surprise is how many people behave as if history will somehow spare them because the current decade feels more advanced. That is what makes personal capital preservation so powerful. You may not control the national debt. You may not control interest rates. You may not control how markets price risk next quarter. You do control whether your own household is fragile or resilient. And resilience is what turns periods of stress into periods of opportunity. I have often said that you do not find out who has been swimming naked until the tide goes out. That line applies just as much to households as it does to businesses or markets. Late cycle periods remove disguises. A person living well beyond their means can look stable right up until the moment the assumptions underneath them weaken. Then the truth appears all at once. The family with large payments, thin savings, rising consumer habits, and no margin becomes exposed. The family that lived below its means resisted lifestyle inflation, and accumulated liquid capital becomes dangerous, in the best sense of the word, dangerous because it can act when others cannot, dangerous because it is not forced to liquidate, dangerous because it can think clearly. While the crowd panics, that is where real wealth transfer happens. People often misunderstand the phrase wealth transfer. They imagine some mysterious event where a secret group suddenly gets rich. Usually the process is much plainer. Wealth transfers from the overleveraged to the liquid. It transfers from the impatient to the disciplined. It transfers from those who must sell to those who can buy. It transfers from those who confuse consumption with prosperity to those who quietly built reserves and productive ownership. The pattern is ancient. In inflationary periods, households without real assets or pricing power see their purchasing strength erode. Those who prepared, saved, owned productive claims, and stayed flexible can acquire more, while others are simply trying to survive. In credit contractions, overextended owners become forced sellers. The patient buyer, not because he is morally superior, but because he preserved capacity, steps in the world, then calls him lucky. Luck always gets too much credit in finance. Preparedness deserves more. Think about the 1970s. Think about 2008. Think about any society that passed from easy leverage into some form of pressure. The people hurt most were not always the least intelligent. Very often they were simply positioned in a way that left them no room. They had obligations with no cushion. They had habits with no discipline. They had confidence with no liquidity. Once the environment turned, they did not get to negotiate with arithmetic. Arithmetic always wins. That is why I want to emphasize something unfashionable. Building wealth is not mainly a matter of sounding sophisticated. It is not a matter of posting market opinions, predicting dramatic dates, or parroting grand macro theories in public. Most lasting wealth is built by combining a few sound principles with relentless behavioral consistency. Spend less than you earn. Avoid debt that finances decline rather than productivity. Refuse to let image dictate allocation. Guard against recurring leaks. Direct the surplus into assets that can grow. Then wait. People dislike that formula because it is simple and because it leaves so little room for ego. Simplicity offends people who want a more exciting explanation for why they are stuck. But the simple principles work across a shocking range of environments because they are tied to human nature more than fashion. The person who stops wasting large sums on depreciating vehicles has improved the odds. The person who refuses to stretch for the maximum house has improved the odds. The person who becomes disciplined about daily consumption has improved the odds. The person who exits the status competition has improved the odds. The person who audits recurring charges and stays awake to every dollar has improved the odds. Do that consistently. And by the time the broader cycle turns ugly, you are no longer hoping to survive. You are positioned to act. That is a very different emotional experience. It is the difference between fearing lower prices and welcoming them. It is the difference between praying for stability and preparing for volatility. It is the difference between asking how bad things may get and asking what wonderful assets may soon become available at foolish prices. Most people cannot make that psychological transition because they spend every good year making themselves more fragile. They upgrade everything when times are easy. They add commitments when rates feel manageable. They let fixed expenses rise to match income. They treat every pay increase as permission to consume rather than as a chance to widen the gap between earnings and spending. Then the cycle shifts and they discover they built a life that requires perfect conditions. Perfect conditions do not last. I have always preferred a structure that does not demand perfection. A sound financial life should be able to withstand boredom, disappointment, volatility, and temporary discomfort. It should not collapse because one variable moved against you. That is what margin of safety means outside the stock market. It means leaving room in the household balance sheet, room in spending, room in commitments, room in expectations. Room is expensive to create in the short term because it requires saying no. It is priceless in the long term because it creates freedom. Some people hear all this and think I am describing deprivation. I am not. I am describing control. A person who can enjoy life while keeping spending well below capacity has control. A person who needs increasing consumption just to feel normal has surrendered control. A person who can watch others display status without needing to imitate them has control. A person who needs the crowd's approval to justify each major purchase has surrendered control. A person whose monthly statement is clean, intentional, and aligned with long-term goals has control. A person whose money disappears into autopilot habits and emotional spending has surrendered control. Control is what preserves capital. Capital is what creates options. Options are what allow ordinary people to become extraordinary beneficiaries of extraordinary times. If a major debt adjustment arrives over the next phase of the cycle, it will not reward people for being fashionable. It will reward them for being liquid, disciplined, and psychologically independent. It will reward those who can endure uncertainty without having to sell the future to pay for the present. That is why these 5 categories matter so much. They are not just budget items, they are preparation signals. They tell you whether a household is building resilience or eroding it. Every new luxury car financed far beyond necessity says something. Every oversized housing commitment says something. Every month of unconscious food and convenience spending says something. Every status purchase says something. Every forgotten subscription says something. They all answer the same question. Are you preparing to own more of the future, or are you pre-spending it? I know which side I want to be on. I do not want to enter a stressed environment with admiration from strangers and obligations to banks. I do not want a driveway that looks prosperous and a brokerage account that looks starved. I do not want a beautiful image and a weak position. I want productive assets, cash reserves, low fixed pressure, emotional calm, and the ability to act when the crowd is trapped. That is the real point behind living below your means. It is not a slogan. It is the mechanism by which patience is funded. You cannot be patient in markets if you are financially desperate in life. You cannot take advantage of fear if your own household budget is frightening you. You cannot compound seriously if you treat every spare dollar as fuel for lifestyle performance. So I would urge anyone hearing this to stop looking for a dramatic solution. First, begin with the ordinary leaks. Look at the car. Look at the house. Look at the food habits. Look at the status habits. Look at the recurring charges. Look honestly, not defensively. The purpose is not guilt. The purpose is liberation. Every dollar you reclaim from foolish consumption is a worker you can send into the field of compounding. Every obligation you avoid is pressure removed from your future self. Every act of discipline now increases the probability that the next hard period will become an opening rather than a disaster. Dalio's work over centuries matters because it reminds people that the big picture is not random. When governments, households, and markets grow accustomed to debt-supported comfort, the final stage is usually harshest for those who prepared least. By the time the public consensus finally recognizes the danger, the people who did the boring work early are already in position. That is what history teaches when you strip away the noise. The people who win the transfer are not always the loudest, the flashiest, or the most certain. They are often the people who did a handful of basic things correctly for a long time while others were distracted by appearance. They bought utility instead of status. They bought room instead of maximum leverage. They bought groceries instead of endless convenience. They bought dignity instead of envy. They bought awareness instead of autopilot. Most important of all, they bought productive assets with a capital that everyone else consumed. That is how wealth shifts, not all at once, not by magic, by arithmetic, behavior, and time. And when the final stage of a debt cycle begins to press harder, those 3 forces become unforgiving. The household that ignored them feels ambushed. The household that respected them feels ready. I know which outcome I would rather own. If you want the future to belong more to you and less to your creditors, less to advertisers, less to vanity, and less to habit, then the place to begin is not with prediction. It is with discipline. It is with the next purchase. It is with the next recurring charge. It is with the next decision to consume or to compound. Make enough of those decisions correctly, and the next 18 months, no matter how noisy or uncomfortable they become, may not be the period that destroys you. They may be the period that changes your financial life for good.